The night air was thick with silence, the kind of silence that only comes after a storm has passed and left nothing but emptiness behind. Emma Clark woke up with a jolt, her body stiff and sore from lying on the cold wooden bench of the train station. Blinking against the dim light of the overhead lamps, she looked around, disoriented. The station was empty, not a soul in sight. The last train had already left, its whistle fading into the distance an hour ago. Her heart sank as she glanced at the small, crumpled ticket in her hand. It was worthless now. She had missed her chance. The wind outside began to pick up, sending a chill through the cracked windows. Emma shivered and pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. With only $2 in her pocket and a single carpet bag containing her meager belongings, she had no idea what she was going to do next. The storm was still on its way, dark clouds swirling overhead, and the station doors were locked tight. She was stranded, alone, and with nowhere to go. Her thoughts drifted back to why she had come here in the first place. She had fled Chicago 3 days ago, desperate to escape her controlling fiancé, Marcus Thornton. He had expected her to marry him, live under his strict rules, and submit to a life of isolation. But Emma had wanted something different. She had found a teaching position in Copper Ridge, a small town 40 miles away, and with the little inheritance her late mother had left her, Emma had bought a ticket, packed up, and left a life that suffocated her. She hadn't looked back, not even when Marcus had sent letters begging her to return. Now, here she was, stuck at a deserted station, miles away from the life she had hoped to build. As Emma sat there, lost in her thoughts, she heard the soft sound of footsteps approaching. Her head snapped up. In the dim light of the station, a figure appeared, stepping from the shadows of the waiting area. The man's silhouette was outlined by the light from the lamp, and as he drew closer, she could make out the rough outline of his clothes. A man who had seen hard work, worn boots, and a weathered face that spoke of years of experience. "Looks like you're stranded," the man said, his voice deep and steady, with a calmness that made Emma feel oddly reassured. Emma didn't know what to say. She wanted to ask who he was, why he was here, but the words wouldn't come. She was used to being guarded, to keeping her thoughts to herself. But this man, he didn't seem threatening. He didn't demand anything from her. In fact, he looked just as tired and lost as she felt. I missed the last train," Emma finally stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what to do." The man studied her for a moment, his dark eyes softening with understanding. He didn't seem surprised or concerned. Instead, he took a step closer, tilting his hat up slightly to get a better look at her. "Where are you headed?" he asked, his voice still calm, but with a hint of curiosity. "Copper Ridge," Emma replied, almost instinctively. "I was supposed to be there already, but now." "You're not the first to miss a train," the man said with a small, knowing smile. "Don't worry, Copper Ridge is still a good ways away, but I'm headed that way myself. Got room in the wagon for one more." Emma hesitated. Her mind raced with thoughts of what could go wrong. The warning bells went off in her head. She didn't know this man. He could be anyone, but then she looked at him again. His eyes weren't the eyes of a stranger trying to take advantage. They were kind, a little tired, but not cruel. Maybe she was being foolish, but she didn't have many choices. The storm was coming, and the night was growing colder. The man's words broke her train of thought. "How about a wagon just outside? It's not much, but it'll get you to Copper Ridge. You won't find another ride this late." Emma stood up, her legs weak and stiff, and looked around one last time at the empty station. No one else was coming. No other options. She had to make a choice. "Why are you helping me?" she asked before she could stop herself. He smiled faintly, lifting his hat in a casual, almost respectful gesture. "Because someone once helped me when I was in a tough spot. Figured it's time to return the favor." Emma could feel the weight of her decision pressing down on her. Should she trust this man? Should she climb into a wagon with a stranger in the middle of nowhere? She didn't know the answers, but she also knew she didn't have much of a choice. She couldn't stay in the station. not with the storm coming. "I'll go," she said finally, her voice steady but with a trace of uncertainty. "Thank you." The man nodded, his eyes softening. "No need for thanks. Just get your things and follow me." As she grabbed her bag and followed him out into the rain, Emma felt the weight of the night settling over her. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in days, she felt a tiny spark of hope. Maybe this was the chance she had been looking for. Maybe this man, this cowboy, was her way out of the storm. Just before she climbed into the wagon, Emma glanced over her shoulder at the empty station one last time. The man in the shadows, the one who had been watching her from the saloon, was still there. His eyes locked with hers for a brief moment before he turned and disappeared into the darkness. Emma shivered, but she didn't let it stop her. The storm was here, and so was her new beginning. The wagon jolted as it hit a rough patch of road, the sound of the rain pounding against the canvas roof echoing in the night. Emma sat silently next to Jack, her hands clutching her carpet bag tightly in her lap. She could barely see through the blur of raindrops and swirling mist, but Jack seemed to know exactly where he was going, steering the horses with ease. The storm had come faster than they had expected, a torrential downpour that soaked them both in minutes. Emma shivered, not from the cold, but from the heaviness of everything. The weight of the choices she had made, the fear of the unknown, and the memories of a life she was trying to leave behind. Jack, sensing her discomfort, broke the silence. "Don't worry. There's a line shack up ahead. We can wait out the storm there." His calm voice had a steadying effect, and Emma nodded silently, grateful for his assurance. She had barely known the man for a few hours, yet something in his presence made her feel safer than she had in a long time. As the wagon bumped along, she couldn't help but wonder about Jack's life, about why he was headed north to Copper Ridge, and what had brought him to this lonely stretch of road. But she didn't ask. The rain was too loud, and the night was too dark for conversation. They traveled in silence, the only sound the rhythmic patter of the rain and the creaking of the wagon wheels. After what felt like an eternity, Jack pointed toward a small structure in the distance. "That's it," he said, his voice low. "We'll make it there soon." As they approached the shack, Emma could see its outline against the stormy sky. A simple, one-room cabin, its windows dimly lit from the inside. Jack pulled the wagon to a stop and helped her down, guiding her toward the door. The wind howled around them as they hurried inside, the warmth of the fire inside greeting them like a promise of safety. Jack quickly set about starting the fire, and Emma, still drenched from the storm, began to wring out her shawl. The cabin was simple, wooden walls, a single hearth, 2 bunks on either side of the room, but it was a refuge from the storm. As the fire crackled to life, Emma began to relax, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. Jack motioned to the small table in the corner. "Make yourself at home," he said, his voice kind but tired. "We've got the night to wait out, so we might as well make the best of it." Emma nodded, her mind still racing with questions. She hadn't expected to be here, in this small cabin with this stranger, and yet there was a strange sense of peace settling over her. For the first time in days, she felt a little safer, a little less alone. As the storm raged outside, she felt herself begin to let her guard down just a little. It wasn't much, but it was something. Jack had offered her shelter, and now she had a chance to breathe. The fire crackled as they both sat down, the warmth of the cabin in stark contrast to the cold, stormy night outside. Neither of them spoke immediately, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. Jack, for his part, seemed content to let Emma settle in at her own pace. He busied himself with the fire, occasionally glancing at her to make sure she was okay. Emma, on the other hand, found herself gazing into the flickering flames, her thoughts wandering to the life she had left behind. She had fled Chicago to escape Marcus, to escape a life that had been suffocating her. But now, she was alone again, and the road ahead seemed uncertain. Yet there was something about Jack, something in the way he had come to her aid without hesitation, that made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to move forward. She wasn't ready to trust fully, not yet, but there was hope, a glimmer of it, in the quiet moments of the storm. As Jack began to speak, his voice broke through her thoughts. "I'm glad we found this place. The storm's a bad one." His tone was casual, but there was an underlying edge of something, concern, perhaps, or just the heaviness of the night. Emma looked at him, then, really looked at him, noticing the lines around his eyes, the way his hands moved with purpose as he tended to the fire. She didn't know his story yet, but she knew he was a man who had seen hardship, and, somehow, that made her feel a little less alone. "Thank you," she said quietly, the words coming more easily than she expected. "For everything." Jack gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, his gaze steady. "No need to thank me. I couldn't just leave you out there in the rain." The storm raged on outside, but inside the cabin, there was warmth, there was shelter, and there was a quiet understanding between them. As the fire crackled and the wind howled around the shack, Emma realized that she wasn't entirely sure where the road would take her next. But for the first time in a long while, she wasn't as afraid of what might come. She had found something unexpected here, something that made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she was on the right path. And for the first time in a very long time, she let herself believe it. The storm's intensity had not subsided. The wind howled outside the cabin, and the rain beat against the walls, filling the space with a rhythmic, almost hypnotic sound. But inside, the warmth of the fire did little to chase away the tension between Emma and the man who had come to her aid. She had barely started to relax when the stillness of the night was broken by the sound of hooves, faint but persistent. Emma froze, her heart suddenly racing as she glanced at Jack. He had been silently stirring the fire, his brow furrowed in thought, but now he looked toward the door with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Someone's out there," he muttered, his voice low, almost too calm for the circumstances. Emma's breath caught in her throat. Who could it be? She felt a sense of dread creeping into her chest, the kind of dread that had settled in her stomach many times before when she was with Marcus. But this was different. This wasn't him. It couldn't be. But the shadows outside the cabin seemed to grow darker, more threatening as the hooves grew louder, closer. Jack, ever the silent protector, stood and moved toward the door. Emma's eyes followed him. She wanted to say something, tell him to be careful, ask him what was going on, but the words caught in her throat. She just watched, helpless, as he swung the door open slowly, peering into the storm's fury. Through the rain-soaked night, a silhouette emerged. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, his face obscured by the darkness. "You expecting company?" Emma asked, her voice shaky, still fighting the surge of panic in her chest. Jack didn't respond, his focus entirely on the figure before him. The man on horseback didn't stop at the door. He dismounted quickly, moving with a purpose. As the man approached, his face came into view. His features were rough, weathered like Jack's, but colder. His eyes gleamed with a hard edge that made Emma instinctively step back, her heart racing in fear. "What do you want?" Jack asked, his voice colder now, warning. The stranger didn't speak immediately, but looked at Emma, his eyes scanning her face with unsettling familiarity. "I'm looking for Emma Clark," the man said, his voice gruff and businesslike. His eyes flicked back to Jack, sizing him up before turning to Emma. "I've been hired to bring you back." The mention of her name sent a chill through Emma, but it wasn't the man's voice that frightened her. It was the mention of being brought back. She knew exactly who had sent him. Marcus. The anger and fear she had been keeping at bay suddenly surged forward, leaving her weak in the knees. "Marcus sent you," she said softly, her voice barely audible. "I'm not going back," she added quickly, as if the words were a mantra she had been repeating to herself since leaving Chicago. The man's eyes narrowed as he looked her over. "That's not for you to decide," he replied, his tone hard and unwavering. "Your fiancés offered a good sum for your return." Emma felt a knot tighten in her chest. The man's demeanor was cold, professional, as if this were nothing more than a job to him. But for Emma, this was everything. This was the culmination of her greatest fear, the reality of Marcus's control creeping back into her life. Jack stepped forward, blocking the man's path, his broad frame an unspoken challenge. "She's not going anywhere with you," Jack said, his voice low but firm. "She's not your property." The man seemed to hesitate for a moment, a flicker of doubt crossing his face, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "I'm just here to do a job," the man said, pulling the revolver from his holster with an almost practiced ease. "And I intend to finish it." Jack's posture didn't change. He didn't move, didn't flinch, but Emma saw his hand twitch, ready to protect her at all costs. The man raised the revolver, aiming it squarely at Jack, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes, a question, a hesitation. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She had never been in a situation like this before. The violence, the confrontation, it was all too much. She wanted to run, wanted to escape, but she couldn't move. "Stop," Emma said, her voice surprisingly steady. The man's gaze snapped to her, his expression unreadable. "I don't want any trouble," she said, taking a deep breath. "I'll go back with you. I'll go back to Chicago." The words tasted bitter on her tongue. She had come this far. She had escaped. But the fear, the terror of what Marcus would do if she didn't comply, gripped her heart. She saw Jack glance at her, his eyes searching hers for any sign of hesitation. His expression softened, just slightly, but he didn't back down. The man, still holding the revolver, seemed to consider her words for a moment. The wind howled outside, but the storm didn't feel as loud anymore. There was a tense silence before the man spoke again, his tone dripping with disdain. "You're making a mistake," he said, his lips curling into a smirk. "He's not going to let you go that easily." Jack's voice was calm but resolute. "You're going to leave now," he said, his eyes hardening, every muscle in his body tensed. The man narrowed his eyes, clearly sizing up Jack, but after a moment, he seemed to make a decision. With a sharp motion, he holstered his revolver. "You've got 24 hours," he said. "I'll be back tomorrow to get you." And with that, he turned, leaving the cabin as quickly as he had entered, disappearing into the night as the storm raged on. Emma's legs gave way, and she collapsed onto the nearest bunk, her body shaking uncontrollably. The weight of everything, her past, her fears, her future, crushed her all at once. Jack stood silently by the door, his eyes fixed on the place where the man had disappeared. After a long moment, he turned to her, his expression softening. "You're not going back to him," Jack said, his voice steady, unwavering. "I promise you that." Emma looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear, relief, and gratitude. "But how? What if he comes back?" Jack's voice was firm. "We'll fight for you. I won't let him take you." And for the first time since she had fled Chicago, Emma felt a flicker of hope. A small, fragile thing, but it was there. She wasn't alone anymore. She didn't have to face Marcus or the life he wanted for her. She had Jack, and together, they would find a way to stop him. The storm continued outside, but inside the cabin, Emma found a strange peace. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but for the first time, she believed that she had the strength to face whatever came. The road ahead was uncertain, but she wasn't walking it alone. The days following the confrontation with the bounty hunter were filled with a strange mixture of tension and quiet moments. Emma couldn't shake the fear of Marcus returning, of being dragged back into the life she had fought so hard to escape. But Jack's presence was a steadying force. Every time the storm clouds rolled in or the wind picked up, she felt the anxiety begin to creep back. But Jack was always there, calm and resolute, telling her that they would face it together. In the mornings, they worked side by side, repairing fences and clearing the overgrown land surrounding the cabin. Emma had never worked this hard in her life. The physical labor was exhausting, but it gave her something to focus on, something tangible to hold on to. Every fence post she drove into the ground, every garden row she planted, felt like a small victory. The work was hard, but the sense of accomplishment it brought her was worth every aching muscle. Jack, too, worked tirelessly, his hands rough from years of labor, his eyes always scanning the horizon as though waiting for something or someone to come. Emma couldn't help but notice how his movements had a quiet grace to them. He wasn't just doing the work because it needed to be done. He was doing it because he had to, because this was his way of rebuilding a life that had been shattered. Every time she saw him at the barn, hammering nails into the weathered wood or tending to the animals with quiet patience, Emma felt a deep respect for him and something more. She wasn't ready to admit it, not yet, but she felt something growing inside her, a connection, a bond that was more than just gratitude. And she couldn't deny that it scared her. She wasn't ready for another relationship, not after Marcus. But with Jack, there was no pressure, no expectations. He was there, and he let her take things at her own pace. They ate together, worked together, and shared long silences by the fire where Emma could finally relax, her body at ease for the first time in years. Jack had a way of making her feel safe, of making the world feel a little less dangerous. He wasn't perfect. He had his own ghosts, his own wounds that he carried with him. But he never pushed her to confront them. He simply allowed her to be. And slowly, very slowly, Emma began to open up to him. She began to share pieces of her life, the parts that had haunted her, the things she had never told anyone. One evening, as they sat together by the fire, Emma took a deep breath and spoke, her voice quiet but steady. I was never allowed to make my own decisions, Jack. Not with Marcus. He controlled everything. My clothes, my friends, even my thoughts. He didn't just want me. He wanted to own me. I didn't have a choice in anything. She paused, her throat tight with the weight of the words. Jack didn't interrupt. He simply nodded, his gaze never leaving her face. I know what it's like to feel trapped, he said softly, his voice low with emotion. I lost Sarah, my wife, and my little girl. They died 4 years ago, and I sold the ranch I'd worked so hard to build. I couldn't stay there after they were gone. So I've been drifting, trying to find something to hold on to, something to give me a reason to keep going. And when I found this place, I thought maybe I could start again. But it hasn't been easy. Emma didn't know what to say, so she simply reached out, her hand brushing his gently. It was the first time she had ever touched him like that, and her heart skipped a beat at the tenderness in his expression. They sat in silence for a moment, the fire crackling between them. Emma could feel the weight of their shared pain, the connection that had slowly started to form between them. She didn't know where it would lead, but for the first time, she felt like she was on the right path. Slowly, the days began to blend together, the work becoming a familiar routine. Emma learned to ride horses despite her initial fear. Jack had been patient with her, teaching her how to handle the horse with gentle commands. And although she wobbled at first, she soon gained enough confidence to ride with him to the nearby town for supplies. Copper Ridge was a small, quiet place, just a few streets with a church, a general store, and a saloon where the local men gathered after a long day's work. Emma couldn't help but feel out of place when they arrived. She was still a stranger here, and the locals eyed her with a mixture of curiosity and judgment. But Jack was always there beside her, his presence a shield against the whispers and stares. He introduced her to Doc Henderson and his wife, Clara, who were kind and welcoming. Clara even invited them to a church social the following week, a gesture that Emma initially hesitated to accept, but eventually did. It was the first time in years that she felt like she was part of something, even if it was just a small-town gathering. The social was a mix of laughter, music, and uncomfortable small talk. The women, most of them older than Emma, were polite but distant. Some were curious about her, while others made her feel like an outsider. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that she was there, and she was no longer running. After the social, as they walked back to the wagon, Jack slipped his hand into hers, his fingers warm and reassuring. They didn't speak for a while, just walked in silence, but the quiet felt comfortable. For the first time, Emma didn't feel so alone. She felt like maybe, just maybe, she could make a life here. That night, as they sat on the porch of the cabin, the stars above shining brightly, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that things were changing. There was something in the air, something she couldn't quite put her finger on, that made her heart beat a little faster. She looked over at Jack, his face bathed in the soft glow of the lantern, and for the first time, she didn't feel the heavy weight of her past. She felt light, as though the shackles that had bound her for so long were starting to loosen. "Jack," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what I'm doing here, but I know I don't want to leave." Jack turned to her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, there was only silence between them, but then he reached over, taking her hand in his. "Stay as long as you need," he said softly. "No pressure, no expectations. Just take your time. We're both rebuilding." Emma's heart swelled with a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to experience in years. Hope. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, she felt like she had a choice. She didn't have to go back to Marcus. She didn't have to follow anyone's rules but her own. She was free, and for the first time, she could see a future that didn't involve fear or pain. She could see a future that involved Jack. There were still many things left unsaid, many fears left to face, but for the first time in a long time, Emma felt like she was home. And when Jack kissed her forehead that night, a soft and gentle gesture, she didn't feel afraid. She felt loved. The journey they were on together had only just begun, but Emma knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to face it alone. The quiet that had settled over the ranch in the days following the church social was shattered by a sense of impending doom. Emma woke one morning to the sound of horses approaching, the unmistakable clatter of hooves echoing in the stillness of the early morning. Jack was already outside, preparing the horses for another day of work, but something in the air had changed. Emma could sense it before she saw it, an unease that settled over her like a weight. The previous few weeks had felt like a dream, a peaceful existence far removed from the life she had fled in Chicago. But now, that peace seemed fragile, like a house of cards on the verge of collapsing. She stepped outside, shielding her eyes from the morning sun as she looked toward the road. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw the riders, two men, one on horseback, the other on a wagon, approaching the ranch. Emma's pulse quickened. She recognized one of the riders immediately. It was Marcus. She froze, her breath caught in her throat, as memories of the man she had tried so hard to escape flooded back. He had come for her, just as he said he would. He had always been a charming man, smooth-talking and manipulative, but underneath that polished exterior was a darkness that had crushed her spirit. Emma had run from him, but now it seemed he had come to take back what he thought was his. Jack, sensing her distress, turned to face her, his eyes narrowing when he saw the men approaching. His posture changed, becoming more protective, more alert. "Get inside," he said, his voice firm. Now, Emma wanted to argue, to stand her ground, but she knew Jack was right. The fear that had been building inside her for weeks now had a name, and that name was Marcus. She turned and hurried into the cabin, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't want to face him. She didn't want to relive the past, but she knew that facing him was inevitable. Marcus had never been the type to let go easily. He wanted her back, and he wouldn't stop until he had her. Inside the cabin, Emma felt the walls closing in on her. She could hear the muffled voices of the men outside, the sound of Marcus's smooth, persuasive tone cutting through the air like a knife. Jack was arguing with him, trying to stand his ground, but Emma could tell by the change in his voice that Marcus was relentless. She closed her eyes, trying to shut out the voices, but they wouldn't leave her head. The memories of a life she had run from, the controlling grip Marcus had over her, the threats, the cruelty, it all came rushing back in a flood of emotion. She thought about the bruises on her wrists, the isolation, the way Marcus had tried to dictate every aspect of her life. She had escaped from that, and now he had come to take it all back. She couldn't go back to that life. She couldn't let him win. As the voices outside grew louder, Emma's resolve began to harden. She couldn't stay in the cabin, hiding behind walls. She had to face him. She had to take control of her life once and for all. She walked to the door, her heart hammering in her chest. She paused, her hand on the doorknob, and took a deep breath. When she opened the door, Marcus was standing just outside, his cold eyes fixed on her. He was dressed in his usual sharp clothes, his hair perfectly combed, but there was a hardness in his expression that made her stomach churn. "Emma," he said softly, his voice laced with false sweetness. "I've been looking for you. I didn't think you'd run away like this." He looked over at Jack, his smile tight and calculated. "And I see you found yourself a new protector." How quaint. Jack stepped forward, his body tense, his eyes narrowed in anger. "She doesn't belong to you, Marcus," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You're not taking her anywhere." Marcus's smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "I'm not here to fight Jack," he said smoothly. "I'm here to take Emma back where she belongs. She's my fiancée, and I will not let her run off like some runaway bride." Emma's hands clenched into fists at her sides. The words stung, but she refused to let them control her. "I'm not your fiancé anymore," she said, her voice steady but firm. "I left you. I'm not going back." Marcus's eyes flashed with anger, his jaw tightening. "You think you can just walk away from me? You're mine, Emma. You always were. I will make sure you come back with me." His voice was cold now, his true nature slipping through the cracks in his polished exterior. Emma felt a shiver run down her spine, but she stood her ground. "No," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. "I won't go back to you. Not now, not ever." The tension in the air was thick, and for a moment, Emma wasn't sure what would happen next. Marcus was a man used to getting what he wanted, and Jack, for all his strength, was just one man standing in his way. Emma could see the threat in Marcus's eyes, the promise of violence if she didn't comply. But she wasn't afraid of him anymore. She had spent too long living in fear, and she wouldn't let him control her any longer. Jack stepped closer to her, placing a hand on her shoulder, offering her the strength she needed. "We're not afraid of you, Marcus," he said, his voice unwavering. "If you want her, you'll have to go through me." Marcus's smile was cold and humorless. "I don't need to go through you, Jack. I have other ways of getting what I want." He looked at the sheriff, who had been standing by, observing the exchange. "Sheriff, I have a legal claim to this woman. I demand you take her into custody." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably, clearly caught between the law and his own conscience. He had known Marcus for years, but there was something in the air now, something that made him hesitate. "I'm just doing my job," he muttered, looking down at the ground. "But, Miss Clark, I need to ask you some questions." Emma's heart pounded in her chest. This was it. This was the moment when everything would change. She took a deep breath and stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "I don't belong to him," she said, looking directly at the sheriff. "He's controlled me my entire life. But I'm not going back. I'm not his anymore." Jack nodded in agreement, his eyes steady. "She's made her choice. She's free now, and we'll fight to protect that." The sheriff looked between Emma and Jack, his expression conflicted, but something seemed to shift in him. He hesitated for a moment longer, then nodded reluctantly. I'll need some time to sort this out, but I can't take her without proof." Marcus's face twisted in anger. "You're making a mistake, Sheriff," he growled. "You don't know what you're dealing with." But the sheriff remained firm. "I'll give you 24 hours to gather your evidence, Marcus," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "If you don't have it, then she stays here. And if you try anything, I'll arrest you myself." Marcus's face darkened with fury, but he said nothing. He turned to leave, his eyes burning with malice. As the men mounted their horses and began to leave, Emma let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Jack placed a hand on her back, his touch warm and comforting. "It's not over," he said softly, "but we'll face it together." Emma nodded, her eyes still fixed on the road where Marcus had disappeared. She wasn't sure what would happen in the next 24 hours, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to let him take her back. Not now. Not ever. The days following Marcus's confrontation felt like a fragile truce, one that could easily be shattered with a single misstep. Emma woke each morning with a sense of unease settling deep within her chest, but she pushed it aside, knowing that she had made a choice, one that was hers to keep. The promise that Jack had made to her, that they would face Marcus together, had a weight to it. It was more than just words. It was a commitment that she couldn't ignore, a bond that was slowly growing stronger with each passing day. Jack had become her anchor, steady and unyielding, and though she still struggled with the fear that Marcus might return at any moment, she knew, deep down, that she wasn't facing this alone. The ranch, once a place of uncertainty and fear, had slowly begun to feel like home. It wasn't the grand estate that Emma had once dreamed of, but it was hers. The land, the cabin, the sense of belonging, it was all hers now. She had a future here, a future that didn't involve being controlled, a future where she could make her own decisions. As she stood outside one afternoon, looking over the land they had worked so hard to clear, Emma felt a surge of gratitude that she hadn't known in years. The fear, the anger, the sadness, they still lingered, of course, but they were no longer the defining emotions of her life. In their place was a quiet, steady sense of peace. The wind stirred the long grass, and Emma took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past lifting just a little more with each gust. Behind her, Jack was working on the barn, his broad shoulders moving with purpose as he hammered nails into the weathered wood. His presence was a constant comfort, a reassurance that, no matter what happened next, they would face it together. But even though Jack had become an integral part of her life, Emma couldn't ignore the undercurrent of tension that remained between them. They were building something together, yes, but there were still walls between them, walls that Emma wasn't sure how to bring down. She had started to feel something more for him, something deeper than just friendship, but she didn't know how to acknowledge it, how to name it. She had been in a relationship before, one that had been suffocating and controlling, and the thought of entering another one, even one that was as kind and respectful as Jack's, terrified her. She had spent so long being told what to do, how to feel, who to be, that the idea of choosing for herself, choosing someone, felt like a risk she wasn't ready to take. She had been running from her past for so long that she wasn't sure who she was anymore, let alone who she could become. That night, as they sat together by the fire, Emma's thoughts were heavy. The crackling of the wood and the soft murmur of Jack's voice filled the silence, but Emma could barely focus on his words. She found herself watching him, studying the way his hands moved, the way his eyes softened when he looked at her. It wasn't romantic, not exactly, but there was something about it that made her chest tighten. Jack had never pressured her, never asked for anything beyond her company, and yet, in his quiet way, he was giving her something that no one else had ever offered, the space to be herself. And that was something Emma wasn't sure she knew how to handle. "What's on your mind?" Jack's voice broke through her thoughts, and Emma realized she had been lost in her own head for longer than she realized. She looked up at him, startled for a moment, and then forced a smile. "Nothing, just thinking." Jack didn't press her. He simply nodded, his expression soft and understanding. "You know you can talk to me, right?" he said quietly. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Emma didn't know how to respond. She wanted to tell him everything, the doubts, the fears, the way her heart beat a little faster whenever he was near, but she didn't know how. How could she tell him she was afraid of falling for him? that she wasn't sure she could trust herself to make the right choice, to choose the right person after everything she had been through. Instead, she took a deep breath and let the moment pass. "I know," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm not sure what comes next." Jack smiled, a small, reassuring smile that made Emma's heart flutter despite herself. "No one's sure what comes next," he said, his voice steady. "All we can do is keep moving forward." The simple truth of his words settled into Emma's chest, and for the first time in days, she felt a little lighter. She didn't have to have all the answers. She didn't have to know what would happen next. She just had to keep moving forward one step at a time. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of where that path might lead. The next morning, the sun was shining brightly, casting a warm golden glow over the land. It was a new day, and with it, a sense of possibility. Emma stood outside the cabin, the wind gently ruffling her hair as she surveyed the land. The work they had done in the past weeks had transformed the ranch. The garden they had planted together was beginning to show signs of life, and the barn, though still in need of repair, was taking shape. The future, though uncertain, was slowly becoming clearer. But even with all the progress, Emma still couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something that would change everything. She had tried to push it out of her mind, but the reality of Marcus's threats lingered, and she knew that it was only a matter of time before he returned. But for now, the storm clouds had parted and the sun was shining. She wasn't going to let fear control her anymore. As she stood there, the soft sound of hooves approached from behind. Jack's familiar figure appeared at the edge of the field, his silhouette framed by the golden light of the morning. He was coming toward her, his steady stride a contrast to the uncertainty that had once defined her life. When he reached her, he didn't say anything at first. Instead, he stood beside her, both of them looking out at the land they had worked so hard to rebuild. "It's looking good," Emma said, her voice quiet but filled with pride. "It's getting there," Jack replied, his tone modest. He looked at her then, his expression soft but earnest. "You've done more for this place than you know." Emma turned to look at him, her heart fluttering in her chest. She wanted to say something, to tell him how much she appreciated everything he had done for her, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she simply nodded, grateful for his quiet support, for the way he had never asked anything of her except for her presence. "You've helped me more than I can ever repay," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack didn't respond at first. He simply stood there, looking at her, and in that moment, Emma saw something in his eyes, something more than just friendship. It was there, in the way he was looking at her, in the warmth of his gaze. And for the first time, Emma allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could have a future here with him. It wasn't a promise, not yet, but it was something. It was hope. "You're not alone anymore," Jack said quietly, his voice steady, as though he knew exactly what she needed to hear. And in that moment, Emma believed him. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. And for the first time in a long time, she felt the weight of her past beginning to lift slowly, piece by piece. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't hiding. She was living. And for the first time, she was living on her own terms. And as she stood beside Jack, looking out at the land they had transformed together, Emma realized that this was only the beginning. The future was uncertain, yes, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid of what came next. She was ready for it. They both were. The life they would build together was still in the making, but the foundation had already been laid. And with that, Emma knew that no matter what came, they would face it together. With Jack by her side, she had everything she needed to start anew. The storm had passed, and the sun was shining brighter than ever.